Judaism considers Jesus to be merely a mortal man without any divine nature, and they do not acknowledge Jesus as God. If the world's beauty could be measured in 10 parts, Jerusalem would possess 9 of those parts. It is truly a land flowing with milk and honey. Many years ago, I watched Schindler's List, a major film that most people are probably familiar with as it won various international awards. When watching this film, I was shocked by how faithfully it documented this historical period, feeling almost like a documentary. Many scenes left deep impressions, including one where an SS officer methodically executes prisoners with his handgun. The cold-bloodedness of the SS and the resigned acceptance of the Jewish victims created an incredibly shocking impact at the time. Although many years have passed and many details of the film may have faded from memory, this movie sparked an interest in learning about things beyond the film itself, such as the historical context, the authenticity of the historical figures portrayed, and the actual locations where these historical events took place. After watching this film, many people might wonder why Nazi Germany carried out such large-scale persecution of Jews. To understand this, we must first explain who the Jewish people are. Jews are an ancient people whose origins trace back to the ancient Semites, sharing common ancestry with today's Arabs. It's ironic that today's Israeli Jews and Arabs fight so bitterly. The 5 Middle East wars were essentially conflicts between Jews and Arabs, when they actually share the same ancestral roots as descendants of ancient Semitic peoples. The Jews first settled in what is now Palestine and Asia Minor, and they were monotheistic believers. In the ancient world, shamanism was predominant everywhere. Regardless of the country, shamanism was characterized by polytheistic beliefs and animism. Today, the best preserved form of shamanism is Japan's Shinto religion. The Japanese speak of heavenly and earthly deities, claiming to be a nation of 8 million gods. In ancient Japan, when the population was only a few million, these gods could protect people on a one-to-one basis. This reflects the animistic worship typical of shamanism. In this polytheistic environment, only the Jews firmly believed in monotheism, devotedly worshiping the one true God, Yahweh, which made them stand out from surrounding tribes. This led to their enslavement by Egyptian pharaohs, followed by the prophet Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt back to their homeland. This gave rise to the Old Testament of the Bible and things like the 10 Commandments. What does Israel mean? Israel means a nation that has made a covenant with God, so they consider themselves God's chosen people, a divine nation. That's where the name Israel comes from. Additionally, you might know that during the European Renaissance, there was a famous sculptor named Michelangelo, who along with Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci was considered one of the 3 masters of Renaissance art. Michelangelo created a famous sculpture called David, depicting a handsome young man completely nude. Who was David? David was actually the founding father of Israel, who led the Israelites in establishing their nation. That's why Israel's flag today features a 6-pointed star, right? The Jewish symbol is a 6-pointed star, also called the Star of David. It's David's symbol. The Israelites consider themselves descendants of David. The Israelites went through several periods of Jewish kingdoms, with the kingdoms of Israel and Judah sometimes united and sometimes divided. Most famous was Solomon's Temple, built in Jerusalem, which was destroyed and rebuilt several times. Today, Solomon's Temple has long since been destroyed by the Romans, leaving only one wall. This wall from the site of Solomon's Temple became the spiritual home of the Israeli people, so they call it the Wailing Wall. Because this wall is thousands of years old, there are many cracks in the weathered surface. Israelis often write their wishes on small pieces of paper and insert them into these cracks when making wishes. You often see Israelis praying at this Wailing Wall. Why? It was built by King Solomon, but later the Jewish kingdom was destroyed by Babylonian King Nebuchadnezzar II, who took all the Jews back to Babylon. This was the famous Babylonian captivity in Jewish history, and the temple was destroyed. That's why later, when Iraq fought against Israel, Saddam Hussein considered himself the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, and his most famous armored division was called the Nebuchadnezzar Division. Why? Because it was named after the ancient Babylonian king who destroyed Israel. Later, the Persian Emperor Cyrus conquered the Babylonian kingdom and allowed the Jews to return to their homeland, where they began rebuilding Solomon's temple, right? This area maintained an independent kingdom, but was continuously conquered by powerful foreign regimes until when? Until the Roman Empire period, when the Jewish independent state was completely destroyed. Then, the Jews entered the so-called 1,000-year period of Great Diaspora, with their footprints spreading throughout Europe, North Africa, East Africa, and even as far as China. During China's Song dynasty, a group of Jews settled in Kaifeng, the capital city, and the emperor personally gave them the name Yichilei. What does Yichilei mean? It's Israel, so their religion was called the Yichilei religion, right? They were allowed to build Jewish synagogues. Chinese Jews are the only Jews in the world who have been completely assimilated. These Jews still exist today, but they have gradually forgotten their native language, writing system, and customs, retaining only some religious beliefs. It wasn't until the end of China's Qing dynasty, when the country opened its doors and foreigners entered China, that these Jews began to realize they were different from the surrounding Chinese people. Although they spoke Chinese and had Chinese surnames, they felt their beliefs were unique, and their worship symbols were completely different from those of the Chinese people. Most of the Jewish people dispersed throughout Europe and even Africa. For example, there are many Jews in Ethiopia. These Jews have become black-skinned, looking just like the local black people, but they still maintain their own faith and language. The Jews began dispersing to Europe from 70 CE and even spread to Africa, and later to America, Russia, and all parts of the world. So why were they able to re-establish their state in Palestine after nearly 2,000 years of diaspora? In world history, any other ethnic group scattered for 2,000 years would certainly have disappeared. But Israel maintained everything: Hebrew language, Hebrew writing, the Old Testament, that is, their Judaism. Jews were unwelcome everywhere they went in Europe, and one important reason for this was their unique faith, their monotheistic Judaism. We all know that in medieval Europe, it was basically dominated by Catholicism, or in Eastern Europe by Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Whether Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, or today's Protestant denominations, we can broadly refer to them as Christianity. Christianity basically dominated everything, but only Jews adhered to their own Judaism. Judaism is actually the origin of Christianity, but they refuse to acknowledge Christian scriptures. Christianity considers Judaism as its root. True, there is one God, Yahweh, and Jesus is Yahweh's only son. Yahweh sent his only son to be born among humans to save people. This is Jesus. Then Jesus established this religion, teaching all beings to escape suffering and attain happiness. Jesus was crucified and then resurrected, so Jesus and God are one. He is also divine. However, Judaism believes this is not the case. They believe the true Messiah has not yet arrived. Jesus was just a mortal man without any divine nature. They don't acknowledge him as divine. They don't acknowledge the Christian New Testament, only recognizing their Old Testament. So in this way, in the eyes of European Christians, these people who worship Yahweh and wait for the Messiah's arrival are very different, extremely different. They don't believe in our God. And since they don't believe in our God and don't acknowledge Jesus' divinity, they certainly don't acknowledge the Virgin Mary's divinity either, right? She was just an ordinary woman. What divine nature could she have? Therefore, Jews were discriminated against and looked down upon by Europeans because of their unique beliefs. So, in the eyes of European Christians, they were outcasts who had to find their own places to live. Think about it. These Jews had to find their own places and formed Jewish ghettos. Jews were ostracized by European Christians, right? There were many things Christians could do that we couldn't do. For example, we couldn't serve in the military, right? We couldn't become officials either, and we were rejected by the Christian world. So what could we do? The only option was to engage in commerce. What could make us safer? Money, right? Only having wealth would make us safer. Therefore, Jews heavily developed commercial and industrial civilization. Why are Jews considered clever? The Jewish people's talent for business came about this way. Moreover, Jews have a rule that forbids charging interest when lending money between Jews. If you lend 1 million, you must get back 1 million. You can't say, lend 1 million and get back 1.04 million or 1.06 million. That's not allowed. No interest can be charged. If you can't charge interest between Jews, today you lend to me, tomorrow I repay you. What's the point? How can I make more money? There's only one way. The wool must come from the sheep. What I lose from my fellow Jews, I make back from Gentiles. So why do people have the impression that Jews love to engage in usury? That's the reason. This in turn left Europeans with the impression that Jews were greedy, miserly vampires. That's why in Shakespeare's works, like The Merchant of Venice, aren't all the usurious merchants Jews? Therefore, Jews' image in Europeans' minds got worse and worse. How could it be right for infidels to become wealthy? Why should they? We honestly dedicate ourselves to God, while they don't believe in our God, yet they can get rich and exploit us through usury. What should we do? European monarchs clearly understood the people's thoughts and mindset. When they needed to stir up hatred, needed scapegoats, needed to divert social conflicts, Jews were the perfect punching bag. Or when they needed money, needed to wage war, needed military funds but had no money, and their subjects had already been exploited to nothing, and they had no more justification to exploit them further. After all, they all believed in the same God, and people could complain to the bishops about them. And Europe wasn't absolutely monarchical. They could complain to the church. What could be done? They could target the Jews, target the infidels, which was legitimate. And these people had money too. So in Europe, anti-Semitism was basically a social consensus, right? It wasn't just during the Third Reich period that Hitler suddenly got a bright idea and decided to do it. That's not what it means, right? Why did the Germans all enthusiastically follow along when he did it? Why? Because there was this tradition. They had always been discriminated against. Only one country didn't discriminate against Jews: America. Why? America itself was a melting pot of world ethnicities, so Jews all flocked to America. It was a land of freedom. Only there were we equal with others, so large numbers of Jews entered America. Jews have won 22% of all Nobel Prizes worldwide. Jews are the people who gave us the Bible, Marx and Einstein. So these people were all Jews: science, business, wealth. This is also why America is so pro-Israel. That's the reason. They don't discriminate against Jews. In the 19th century, the most anti-Semitic country was Tsarist Russia, including the early 20th century. Even during Stalin's era, it was the most anti-Semitic. Actually, it was Tsarist Russia, Poland, and these Eastern European countries that were more anti-Semitic, because Eastern Orthodox Christianity was relatively more conservative and more anti-Semitic. After the Nazi Party came to power, they persecuted Jews on an even larger scale, nearly wiping out European Jews. And then large numbers of surviving Jews came to Palestine. These surviving Jews refers to those who had escaped before the Nazis' large-scale persecution of Jews began. There were also some Jews who fled from Eastern Europe. Many of these people were either descendants of concentration camp survivors or were concentration camp survivors themselves. Like fish surviving at the bottom of a pot, they had numbers tattooed on their arms. In the concentration camps, they only had a code, just this number. These people came and established such a country. This was the Zionist movement that arose among Jews in the late 19th century. Where were our ancestors? In Jerusalem. If there were 10 parts of beauty in the world, Jerusalem would possess 9 parts. They believed it was a land flowing with milk and honey, right? Therefore, they went there to establish their own country, and these people came there to establish the state of Israel. So today we're left with the impression that Israelis seem to be very good at fighting, right? Just a tiny country. The First Middle East War broke out in 1948, and now it's been 70 years, right? In 70 years, they've gone through 5 Middle East wars, growing stronger with each fight, standing against over 100 million people from more than 20 countries. Why? It was forged in such harsh conditions, scattered for 2,000 years, massacred, abused, looked down upon for 2,000 years. No other nation has survived after enduring so much suffering. So our nation never abandons anyone. Logically, terrorists should be most likely to bomb Israel. But you see, Israel rarely experiences large-scale terrorist attacks like those in Europe. Why? Because they show no mercy to terrorists and have rich counterterrorism experience. The fact that they've established such a developed country today. We talk about how nations emerge stronger from adversity, but we hope this saying doesn't just remain empty words. The Jewish people have truly achieved this point, scattered for 2,000 years, then coming to this land and today establishing such a flourishing, developed country. Israel's territory is only about 20,000 square kilometers, and 90% is desert. Yet, on such barren, harsh land unsuitable for human habitation, they've managed to become so developed and prosperous, relying on their own technology, their own tenacity, their own persistence to establish such a country. I think this point is really worth learning from.